The land east of Powder River did not forgive weakness. It had no capacity for it. The high desert plateau stretched in every direction, with the indifference of something ancient and permanent. Red rock faces catching the last amber light of late October, while the cottonwoods along the water's edge dropped their remaining gold to a wind that carried the first genuine bite of winter. The sky above Wyoming territory in that season was the particular shade of pewter that meant snow before the week was out, and the silence across the plateau was the kind that pressed against a man's ears until he either made peace with it or went somewhere noisier. Callan Morrow had made his peace 7 years ago. He was 36 years old. He stood 6 feet and a fraction in worn boots broad through the shoulders from years of work that asked everything from the body, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown, and eyes the precise gray-green of sage after rain. His face carried the record of a life lived mostly outdoors, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, from squinting into high-altitude sun, the slight thickening of his nose from a break that healed crooked the deep tan that never fully faded even through winter. He was not a handsome man in any drawing room sense. He was the kind of man that horses trusted on first meeting, which said something more useful. The property sat on a wedge of plateau above the river's eastern bend, 240 acres of mixed grassland and red rock, with a vegetable patch behind the main cabin, a hay barn with a newly replaced east wall, a lean-to stable housing, 2 horses, a sorrel gelding named Trace, and a gray mare with no name he'd ever settled on, and a chicken coop Callan had reinforced 3 times against coyotes. The cabin itself was a single room with a cast-iron stove, a narrow cot pushed against the north wall, 1 shelf of books, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs he'd never had occasion to use simultaneously, and 2 oil lamps that threw more shadow than light in the evenings. It was not a comfortable place. It was a functional one, which in Callan's estimation was the superior quality. The town of Garnet Creek lay 6 miles to the northwest, a cluster of maybe 280 souls, in the winter months, fewer in summer when the transient population moved on to wherever work was moving. Callan went to town twice a month for supplies, spoke to perhaps a dozen people in the course of those visits, and was known there by a reputation he had never cultivated and could not seem to shake. 3 years prior, 4 men had attempted to rob the Garnet Creek stage at Drywash Crossing, while Callan was the only armed civilian present. 3 of the 4 were dead before the horses stopped moving. The 4th had ridden away with a wound that Callan suspected had finished him somewhere in the breaks north of town. Nobody talked to him differently after that. They just talked to him less, which he had not minded at all. What people in Garnet Creek said about Callan Morrow when they said anything was that he was the kind of man you wanted at your back in the dark. What they did not say, because they did not know how, was that he was also the kind of man who had built his solitude so carefully and over such a long time that it had become structural load-bearing the way a wall becomes part of what holds a roof up. Remove it carelessly and something collapses. He had been mending a fence post on the property's eastern edge when he first saw her, though he didn't know who she was in that initial moment. He saw only movement on the dirt road, a figure on foot, which was unusual enough in itself that he straightened from the post and watched. She was walking with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who had been walking for a long time. Not hurrying, not slowing. Simply moving forward with the mechanical determination of a person who has decided that forward is the only direction available. She wore a wool shawl pulled tight at the shoulders against the wind, and her boots, even from 40 yards, showed the particular lean of someone whose left sole had worn through. Callan set down his tools and walked toward the cabin, arriving at the porch at roughly the same moment she reached the gate. He stopped 10 feet from her and studied her the way he studied most things, without expression, without hurry. She was perhaps 24 with brown hair pinned back at the temples, without any particular attention to how it looked, and eyes that were red-rimmed but dry. Not recently crying, recently finished. The distinction mattered. Her face had the look of someone who had moved past the soft part of grief into the harder territory beyond it, where the tears are spent, and what remains is something closer to iron. She held a folded piece of paper against her chest, with both hands pressed there, like a thing she might otherwise lose. She looked at him for a long moment, without speaking, and Callan waited because he had learned over many years that the most important things people said came after the silence, not before. Her chin lifted slightly. Then her voice came out quiet and level, and not quite what he'd expected from someone who had walked 6 miles in the cold. "Father said you needed a wife." Callan said nothing. The wind moved the dry grass along the fence line. A raven lifted from somewhere on the ridge behind the cabin and called once sharp and clear before disappearing over the rock face. He let the silence sit measuring it, and then he answered in the same register she had used flat, direct, no theater in it. Maybe you. Her head came up fast. The shawl slipped from one shoulder, and she caught it without looking, her eyes fixed on him with an expression that cycled through three things in rapid succession. Confusion, the raw edge of something that might have been hope before she'd crushed it down to manageable size, and the beginnings of a wariness that came from expecting refusal so completely that agreement felt like a trap. She had clearly rehearsed this conversation many times on the 6-mile walk, and in none of those rehearsals had she planned for two syllables delivered like the answer to an arithmetic problem. Her name was Nora Hale. She was Edmund Hale's daughter. Callan knew the name the way he knew the land, not as information he had acquired, but as something that had become part of the geography of his life without announcement. Edmund Hale had been a trapper, a part-time lawman, a man of the kind that the Wyoming Territory produced rarely, and needed constantly, the sort who understood that the currency of this country was reliability and who spent it freely. He had died 3 weeks prior. Pleurisy took him in 5 days. Callan had stood at the grave in Garnet Creek's small cemetery and held his hat and said nothing because words had never come easily to him, and grief had never made them come easier. He stepped forward and took the paper she held out to him. The handwriting was Edmund's. He recognized it from the man's field notes, cramped letters that pressed hard into the page, as though the writer distrusted anything written lightly. The letter read, "Callan Nora is too proud to ask and too good to need it. Circumstances have made liars of better people than her. I told her to come to you. I know what I am asking. I know what you are. Look after her. That is all. E. Hale." He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its existing creases and held it at his side. He looked out past the gate toward the river canyon, where a red-tailed hawk was riding a thermal in slow, patient circles above the rock face. And he thought about a night 7 years ago, when the rain had come down so hard it was indistinguishable from the dark, when Edmund Hale had carried him 8 miles through Paiute territory with an arrowhead buried 2 inches into his left shoulder, because Callan couldn't ride and couldn't walk far, and the alternative was dying in the open. Edmund had done it without complaint. He had sat with Callan for 2 nights after changing the poultice on the wound, keeping the fever company with quiet conversation until it broke. He had asked for nothing. Not then, not in the 7 years since. Callan said without looking at her, "Your father carried me 8 miles through bad country in the dark with an arrow in my shoulder because I couldn't make it on my own. He sat with the fever for 2 nights, never asked for a thing in return." Nora's jaw tightened. "He didn't tell me that." "He wouldn't." She looked at him, then directly assessing the way a woman looks at a man when she is deciding whether to trust him with something she cannot afford to lose. "I want to be clear about something," her voice careful and precise as a surveyor's line. "I'm not here asking for charity. I'm not asking for anything. Father told me to come. I came. What you do with that is your business." "How long before the boarding house puts you out?" Something shifted in her face. Not weakness, nothing that soft, but the brief acknowledgement that the practical question had found its mark. 4 days. I owe 3 months on my room at the Larkspur house. Mrs. Fairwick has been patient enough. "Any family in the territory?" "No." Callan nodded once. "Come inside, the wind's picking up." Her chin came up immediately. "I told you I'm not." "I know what you're not." His voice was not unkind precisely because it made no attempt to be kind. It was simply accurate. "Come inside, Miss Hale. We'll talk like 2 people working out an arrangement, not like you're asking for something, and I'm deciding whether to give it." She studied him for another 3 seconds. Then she walked through the gate. Inside, the cast-iron stove had been burning since mid-morning, and the cabin held a warmth that contrasted sharply with the thinning October air. Callan set coffee on, and Nora sat at the table without being invited, her shawl around her shoulders. Still the folded letter placed on the table between them, with the deliberate precision of someone establishing terms before negotiation. She looked at everything in the cabin with the calm inventory of a person who has trained themselves not to react to their surroundings, but who misses nothing. The single shelf of books, the accounts ledger on the side table open to a page of numbers that didn't quite reconcile, the second chair that had dust on its seat. Callan set a tin cup in front of her and poured without asking. She wrapped both hands around it immediately, the way a person does when warmth has been scarce enough that they've stopped taking it for granted. He sat across from her and set his own cup down and put both hands flat on the table. A legal arrangement, civil ceremony before the circuit judge, nothing more than that unless we both decide otherwise. You'd have your own space, your own legal standing, the right to remain on this property. In return, you help run the household, the accounts, the garden, the general management of what I can't keep straight while I'm working the land. Nora looked at the steam rising from her cup. The accounts ledger over there suggests you need the help badly. It's not wrong. A small, involuntary thing crossed her face. Not quite a smile, the muscles of it briefly activated, then recalled. She pressed her lips together. People will talk. People always talk. It doesn't change the weather or what's in the ground come spring. She looked at him. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I know your father. A silence. Outside, the wind found the gap under the door and moved through it as a low sound steady as a held note. Nora looked at the table. Then she looked up. 6 months. If either of us decides after 6 months that the arrangement isn't working, no argument, no legal complication, no obligation. We part as strangers. Callan held her gaze. Agreed. She nodded once, the same single motion he had used at the gate, as though she had picked it up unconsciously. When the circuit judge comes through Garnet Creek Thursday morning. She looked at him one more time, at the stillness of his face, at the way he sat without any of the fidgeting or performance that anxiety produces in men who are less certain of themselves, and she gave a slow, deliberate nod. The negotiation was complete. Neither of them extended a hand to shake on it. The nature of what they had just decided seemed to belong to a different category than handshakes. What Callan did not tell her, what he had not told anyone, was the other thing in that desk drawer. After she had gone back out to retrieve the small bag she'd left at the gate, a canvas satchel that held everything she'd brought, which was not much. Callan crossed to the side table and opened the bottom drawer. He reached past the accounts ledger, in the survey maps, in the spare lamp wicks, until his hand found what he was looking for. A second envelope slightly thicker than the one Nora had carried, sealed and addressed in Edmund Hale's same compressed handwriting. The date on the upper corner read, July 14th, 1883. 3 months before Edmund died. 3 months before Nora had walked up that road. He had received it in the first week of August on an ordinary supply run to Garnet Creek, pulled from the general store's mail slot along with a hardware catalog he hadn't ordered. He had read it twice in the store, once more in the saddle on the way home, then placed it in the bottom drawer where it had stayed since. He had not shown it to anyone. He had not mentioned it. He had simply gone on with the work of living on this land, knowing that at some point before winter closed in, a young woman with red-rimmed eyes and a shawl pulled tight against the wind was going to come walking up his road with a letter pressed against her chest. The letter read, Callan, I am writing this in the knowledge that I won't be writing many more things. The doctor in Carson City used language that men use when they've given up pretending. I have a daughter. You know of her, I think I've mentioned her in the field. Her name is Nora. She is 24 and she is the best thing I ever had a hand in, which is not nothing given some of the things I've had a hand in. When I am gone, there will be debts and very little else, and she will come to the end of her resources before she admits it, because that is precisely who she is. I am telling her to go to you. I am writing to tell you she is coming because I want you to have the chance to prepare, not because I think you need convincing. You don't owe me anything. That is the wrong way to think about this. Think of it instead as something I would do if I were still in a position to do things, which I won't be by the time you read this next letter. E. Hale. Callan put the envelope back in the drawer and closed it. He heard the gate latch behind Nora as she came back through with her bag, and he went to put more wood in the stove. He had been waiting for her since August. Maybe, you, had not been a decision made in the space of 5 seconds. It had been made on a warm August evening by lamplight with a letter in one hand, thinking about a man who had never asked for anything and was asking now. The 2 syllables were simply the moment when the waiting ended. She did not know this. Callan saw no immediate reason to tell her. What she needed in this moment was not revelation, it was coffee and warmth, and the knowledge that Thursday was a fixed point she could move toward. The rest could find its own time. Thursday came in on the back of the coldest night since the previous February. A skim of ice had formed across the water trough by dawn, thin enough to break with one fist, but present in a way that meant the season had stopped being a warning and started being itself. Callan woke before light as he always did, but this morning he did something he had not done since his mother's funeral in Missouri. 11 years prior, he shaved. He located the straight razor in the washstand drawer, stropped it against the hanging leather strip, and worked his face in the dim lamp glow with the careful attention of a man performing an unfamiliar operation. The result was not elegant, but it was honest. He found a clean shirt in the trunk at the foot of the cot. Dark wool, his best kept folded under the spare blankets for occasions he had stopped expecting to have. He pulled it on and checked himself in the blade of his hunting knife, the closest approximation to a mirror the cabin possessed. He looked like what he was, a man made by weather and labor and solitude. Not much to be done about that. He pulled on his coat and went out. Nora was already at the fence line when he came around the corner of the cabin. She stood with her back straight in the cold air, her hands clasped at her waist, wearing a dress the color of sage in winter, deep gray-green with small pearl buttons at the collar that caught the pale early light. The dress had been pressed. He could see it had been pressed with care in the hours before dawn, when the cabin was quiet, the iron heated on the stove. Her hair was done differently than it had been the 2 previous days, pinned at the sides, left loose in the back, a decision that was neither vanity nor indifference, but something more deliberate than either. She stood very straight. She did not look at the ground. Callan stopped a few feet from her. He considered her in silence for a moment, the way he considered the sky when he was reading weather, not performing observation, but actually doing it. Then, "You look well." Her gaze dropped briefly to the dress, then came back up. "It was my mother's, the only good thing I brought." "It's enough," he said. The words came out simpler than he'd intended, with a plainness that made them mean something slightly larger than their face value. He saw her register this, a small adjustment in how she was holding herself. Not a softening exactly, but a reduction of the outermost layer of armor. The way a body relaxes the muscles it doesn't strictly need when a threat proves false. They drove the 6 miles to Garnet Creek in Callan's wagon, the sorrel gelding moving at his usual deliberate pace, the cold air cutting clean across the plateau as the sun came up over the eastern breaks and lit the red rock in the way that made Wyoming look for about 20 minutes each morning like something painted rather than real. Neither of them spoke much. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who are conserving themselves for what's ahead. Garnet Creek was already active when they arrived. Freighters unloading at the general store on the main street, the blacksmith's hammer going steady and rhythmic from the north end of town, a pair of boys chasing each other along the boardwalk with the single-minded energy of children who haven't yet met a Wyoming winter that broke them. People noticed the wagon. People in a town of fewer than 300 souls notice most things. Callan was aware of the noticing without acknowledging it, the way he was aware of the hawk that had been following the wagon's progress from post to post along the road. Judge Calder received them in the back room of the land office with the brisk, unsentimentalized efficiency of a man who had performed this particular function enough times that he experienced it as paperwork rather than ceremony. He was a broad man with a gray beard trimmed close and a black frock coat that had seen better years, and he asked 4 questions in a row without waiting for any answer beyond the most functional confirmation of each. The witness was Silas Greer, a trapper in his late 50s, who happened to be sitting in the land office's front room waiting to file a deed claim. When the clerk asked if anyone was willing to serve as witness for a civil ceremony, Silas looked up from his coffee and said he had no objection, and that was the sum total of his deliberation. He was a large man, quiet by nature, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who has spent enough seasons alone in the Wyoming breaks that other people's business neither surprises nor particularly interests him. The ceremony took 9 minutes. Judge Calder read the required language with the pace of a man reading a grain invoice, not disrespectfully, simply, efficiently. He asked the questions. Callan answered them. Nora answered them. The answers were the same words they would have been for any 2 people standing in that room, and yet they carried some additional weight in the space between these 2 specific people, something that had nothing to do with the language and everything to do with what each of them had brought to this room that they hadn't planned to. When Judge Calder announced the matter settled, Callan looked at Nora, and Nora looked at Callan. The room held its breath for a moment that was not quite as brief as it appeared from the outside. Then Callan offered her his arm, the left one, the shoulder that still ached in cold weather, a detail that only he knew the significance of. Nora took it. Her hand on his forearm was steady and deliberate, and they walked out of the land office and back into the cold Garnet Creek morning as the most ordinary married couple in the territory, which was perhaps the most significant thing either of them had been in a long time. Silas Greer went back to his coffee. Judge Calder moved on to the next piece of paperwork. The blacksmith's hammer continued its steady work from the north end of town. The world outside the land office had no idea anything of consequence had just occurred inside it, which was fine. The world outside most rooms has no idea of most things. On the ride home, the wagon moving at the gelding's patient pace, the plateau opening out wide on both sides, with the dry grass bending in long waves ahead of the northwest wind. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the distance ahead. Callan watched the road. They did not speak for the first mile, and then Nora shifted slightly on the wagon seat, and Callan felt rather than heard the change in her attention before she spoke. "When Father wrote to you," her voice measured not quite casual, "how much did he say?" Callan kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Enough. I've been thinking about the envelope." "I know." A pause. "The one in your coat pocket, the one with his handwriting." Her voice did not rise. "The date on it." Callan said nothing. "July," she said. "He died in October. That's 3 months." She was not asking. She had been working it from the moment on the ride to Garnet Creek, when her fingers had traced the edge of the envelope she'd found in the borrowed coat's pocket. Not opening it, not yet, but measuring it with her hands, the way a blind person reads a face. She had not confronted him about it in town, had performed the ceremony with the envelope's implication sitting in the back of her mind, and was now working toward the truth, the way she worked toward everything directly, without drama, but without hesitation. "You knew I was coming, before I arrived, before Father died." Callan kept his eyes on the road a moment longer, then looked over at her. He did not apologize for the omission or explain it away or soften it. He simply confirmed it. "He wrote in July, told me you'd come when the time was right, asked me to be ready." The silence that followed was a particular kind. Not angry exactly, not wounded. The silence of a person recalibrating, rereading a situation they thought they understood from the beginning, and finding that the geometry of it is different than it appeared. Her hands in her lap had gone very still. "So when you said," she stopped, began again. "Those 2 words. They weren't an accident," he said. "They weren't something I said without thinking." Nora looked ahead at the plateau stretching toward the river canyon. The hawk from the morning was somewhere in the distance, a dark speck working the thermals above the red rock. She was quiet for a long time, and Callan let her be quiet, knowing that what she was doing was not sulking or withdrawing, but thinking the serious, unornamented kind of thinking that his instinct, even in these few days, told him was one of her most fundamental qualities. "He didn't tell me he'd written to you," she said finally. "He wouldn't have, because he knew I wouldn't come if I thought it was arranged." "Probably." Another silence. The wagon wheel found a rut in the road and jolted them both. She reached for the seat rail without looking, steadied herself, released it. "I want to be clear," she said, "that this doesn't change the terms we agreed to. The 6 months, the arrangement as discussed." "I didn't expect it would." She turned her head and looked at him with the precise attention she had given him at the gate, that same unflinching inventory, taking him apart and putting him back together to see how the pieces fit. "You're a strange man, Callan Morrow. I've been told. I don't mean it as a criticism." He looked at her. "I know." The road curved south to follow the river bend, and the plateau gave way on the left side to the canyon wall, dropping 30 feet to the water below the Walker River, running low and clear over its bed of red sandstone. The afternoon light had gone flat and gray, the cloud layer thickening from the northwest. The first snow of the year was still somewhere on the other side of those clouds, gathering itself for descent. When they came in sight of the cabin, the fence line, the lean-to, the garden patch, with its dead stalks standing in the cold. Nora looked at the property for the first time as someone who would wake up inside it tomorrow, which was different from how she had looked at it when she arrived. Property changes its appearance when you're the one responsible for its continuation. It gets both smaller and larger at the same time. She climbed down from the wagon before he could come around to assist her, which he noticed but did not comment on. She collected her canvas bag from the wagon bed. She looked at the cabin for a moment, then at him. "I'll get supper started," she said. "The accounts ledger after." "The accounts can wait until tomorrow." "They've waited long enough." She went up the porch steps without looking back. The door opened and closed. Through the cabin window, dim with the failing afternoon light, he saw the oil lamp come on. Callan unhitched the gelding and led him to the stable, working through the familiar routine of unsaddling and feeding with the automatic competence of 1,000 previous evenings. But the air around the task felt slightly different, denser or more charged, the way air feels before lightning finds it. He stood in the lean-to with his hand on the gelding's flank for a moment after the work was done, listening to the animal's calm breathing, looking through the stable opening at the rectangle of lamplight in the cabin window. Edmund Hale had written, "Think of it as something I would do if I were still in a position to do things." Callan had read that sentence in August by lamplight, and he had sat with it for a long time before he understood what it was asking. Not a favor, not a debt being called in, a continuation. Edmund extending his hand past the edge of his own life, the way a man sometimes throws a rope over a distance. He can't cross himself because someone on the other side needs the rope more than he needs it back. Callan walked back to the cabin. The smell of coffee had already reached the porch. Through the window, he could see Nora moving at the stove, her back to the door, the lamplight catching the pearl buttons down the back of her mother's dress, and in the particular angle of her spine, straight, purposeful, carrying something that was not exactly burden, but was not exactly not burden either. He recognized the posture of a person rebuilding. He knew it because he had worn it himself for several years after he first arrived on this plateau, with $40 and a horse that lasted 2 days. He opened the door and went inside. The stove was going strong. The coffee pot was on. On the table next to the lamp, Nora had already opened the accounts ledger to the last used page and placed his pencil beside it as though she'd known without being told where it was kept. He hung his coat. He washed his hands at the basin. Outside, the first snow of the season began to come down, not urgently, just the quiet arrival of what had been building all day, each flake finding its place on the plateau, as naturally as a fact settling into its proper context. Neither of them said anything about the snow. Neither of them needed to. The winter had begun. The first weeks of the arrangement had a quality that neither of them named, because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required deciding what to do about it. They operated instead on the level of the practical, which was safer ground for both of them. Callan worked the land from before dawn until the light failed. Nora worked the household with the same hours and the same unsentimental commitment, and the cabin that had been a functional place became in the space of 10 days something closer to a managed one. The difference between a tool left on a workbench and a tool clean sharpened returned to its proper place. The accounts ledger was the first thing she fixed. Callan had kept records the way a man keeps records when he is the only one who will ever read them, approximately in a private shorthand. That made sense to him in the moment of writing, but less sense 3 months later. Nora sat with the ledger for 2 evenings, cross-referencing against the receipts he kept in a tobacco tin, and produced on the third morning a revised system written in her clean, precise hand columns for income outgoing, projected seasonal costs, a separate page for the hay and grain inventory with notes on burn rate through winter. Callan studied it for 3 days before he understood the architecture of it, and once he understood it, the thought of returning to the tobacco tin method produced the mild vertigo of a man who has just learned he has been doing something wrong so long, the wrong way has become invisible. She renegotiated the winter wheat price at Garner's Mercantile on her second trip to Garnet Creek. Callan had been paying Garner's standing rate for 4 years without question, which in retrospect was 4 years of paying the rate Garner offered to people who didn't know there was another rate. Nora came back with a price 17 cents per bushel lower and a handshake agreement on first right of refusal for the spring surplus. Callan was working the fence line when she returned, and she told him this information with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone reporting weather, not expecting praise, which was precisely why he filed it carefully in the account of her, that he was building detail by detail the way you build a picture of terrain you plan to navigate. They ate supper at the table every evening. The first 3 nights were mostly quiet, practical exchanges about the day's work. What needed doing tomorrow? The status of the chicken coop's northern wall, which had developed a gap that something nocturnal was exploiting. By the end of the first week, the conversations had grown without either of them deciding to grow them. She told him about following Edmund across 3 territories as a child, watching her father reinvent himself from trapper to part-time lawman to itinerant preacher's aide, with the same cheerful competence he applied to everything. Callan told her in the sparse way he told things about arriving in Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1876, with $40 and a horse that survived exactly 2 days before a bad step on loose rock near the river put it down. He had walked the rest of the way to the plateau on foot, which he had never told anyone, because it seemed like the kind of information that served no purpose. Nora looked at him across the table with the lamp burning between them. You walked here. Had to. On foot, to a piece of land you hadn't seen yet. I'd seen the survey map. Something crossed her face, not quite amusement, not quite admiration, something that occupied the space between them without requiring identification. That's either very brave or very foolish. Callan considered this with the seriousness he gave most questions. Possibly both. She laughed. It was brief surprise out of her, and she pressed her lips together afterward, as though she hadn't quite authorized it. But the cabin held the sound of it longer than its duration, the way a note holds in a room after the instrument stops, and the air between them afterward was different, more permeable, less guarded at its edges. That laugh was the first real thing that had passed between them, and both of them knew it without discussing it. The following morning they returned to their separate work with the same apparent efficiency as before, but something had shifted in the architecture of the silence they moved through. It was no longer the silence of two people maintaining distance. It was the silence of two people who have stopped needing the distance quite so badly, but haven't yet decided what to do with the space it occupied. The envelope had been sitting in the drawer of Nora's side of the cabin for 11 days before she opened it. She had not opened it on the wagon ride home, because the information it contained had already begun to restructure her understanding of the situation, and she needed to sit with the outline of that restructuring before she examined the details. She had not opened it in the days following, because opening it required her to acknowledge that her father had orchestrated this. Not suggested it, not merely hoped for it, but written letters across months planned for a future he would not be present for. Positioned the people in his life like pieces on a board he would not live to see the end of. She had told herself she was processing this gradually. In truth, she was postponing it, which was not the same thing, and on the 11th evening when Callan had gone to the stable to check on the gray mare's sore foreleg, Nora took the envelope from the drawer, sat at the table in the lamplight, and read. Edmund's handwriting. Nora, if you are reading this, you stayed. That matters. I want to tell you something about the man you are now living with because he would not tell you himself. 7 years ago, I helped him out of a bad situation in country that was not forgiving of bad situations. He has carried that ever since, the way some men carry debt and some men carry stone. He is not a man who takes easily. He will not ask for anything he does not believe he has earned. But here is what I know, and what I want you to know. There is more room in him than he has ever used. More room than he knows. I am telling him you are coming. I am telling you to go. The rest is yours to work out. Your father. Nora read it twice. Then she put it flat on the table with both palms on it, as though she could press it back to before it was read. The stove ticked. The wind moved outside. She had traveled 6 miles on foot in cold weather, negotiated a marriage arrangement, rebuilt a stranger's accounting system, and renegotiated a 4-year commercial relationship, all of it from a position of no resources and no real options. And she had done every part of it on the premise that she had made a choice. A hard choice, a pragmatic one, but hers. She had walked up that road of her own will. She had said yes in that land office of her own will, or she had believed she had. The door opened. Callan came in from the cold, bringing with him the smell of horse and winter air pulling off his gloves. He stopped when he saw her at the table with the envelope and her expression, which she had not had time to arrange into anything neutral. His eyes went from her face to the letter to her face again. He did not pretend not to understand what he was seeing. You read it, his voice level. He planned this. Her voice was careful and stripped of its softer registers, the voice she used when she was keeping something from becoming larger than she could manage. He planned all of it. The letter to you in July. The letter to me. He positioned us. Callan crossed to the stove, set a log, and closed the grate. He stayed with his back to her for a moment, which she recognized not as evasion, but as the posture of a man choosing words. Then he turned. He told me you were coming. He asked me to be ready. He didn't tell me what to decide. He knew what you would decide. Probably. The word landed without apology. Nora felt the heat of something move through her chest. Not grief, not anger exactly, something that occupied the register between the two. I came here believing I had arrived at this on my own terms, that this was my decision. My choice about my own life. A pause. He took that from me. Callan looked at her for a long moment. The lamp threw its unsteady light across the table between them. Then he told me what you were. He didn't tell me what to feel about it. The letter in July told me to be ready for a woman I hadn't met. What happened after you walked up that road that wasn't in any letter he wrote? He let that sit, then continued. I didn't marry you because he asked me to. I married you because I read that letter and I wanted to meet the person he described. Those aren't the same thing. The silence that followed was the kind that either breaks something or holds it. Nora looked at the letter on the table, at her father's compressed handwriting, at the word yours in the final sentence. She picked up the envelope and folded it closed along its original creases, the same motion with which she handled everything she needed to contain. She stood up from the table. She went into her side of the cabin without another word, and the curtain she'd hung across that corner of the room fell closed behind her. Callan stayed at the table. He did not follow. He understood with the precision of a man who had spent considerable time in the company of his own difficult emotions that she was not leaving the room in defeat. She was leaving it to do the kind of thinking that required privacy. There was a difference, and it mattered. The following morning, she was at the stove before he was awake. When he came out into the main room, there were 2 cups of coffee on the table. She was making something with cornmeal that involved more attention than the task strictly required. She did not turn around when he sat down, but neither did she send him back to bed. He drank the coffee. She finished what she was making. They ate breakfast without the topic of the evening before surfacing by mutual unspoken agreement, because some things need to be acknowledged once and then given room to settle. Dorothea Aldridge came on a gray Tuesday morning in the second week of December, arriving by way of the road from the north in a black lacquered buggy that looked as out of place on the canyon road as a piece of drawing room furniture left in a field. The buggy was pulled by 2 matched blacks, expensive animals, deliberately matched the kind of horses kept to communicate something rather than purely to work. And the woman who descended from it moved with the composed deliberation of someone accustomed to the fact that rooms rearranged themselves around her arrival. She was somewhere on the near side of 50, dressed in dark wool and silver at her collar, with a face that had once been striking and had since become formidable, which was the better outcome. Her eyes were pale and precise, and they had the quality of instruments calibrated for finding the gap between what a person presented and what they actually were. She had owned the largest cattle operation north of the Powder River since her husband Gerald Aldridge's death 3 years prior, and she had run it since with an iron efficiency that the men who worked for her respected and the men who competed with her feared. She had twice made written offers to purchase Callan's land, the most recent 18 months ago. He had returned both letters with the word no written on the bottom in pencil. What she wanted was the water. Callan's 240 acres sat on the only reliable creek access for 11 miles in either direction, a geological fact that made his wedge of plateau worth considerably more to the Aldridge operation than its market value in raw acreage. Without that water, her northern pasture became a seasonal liability. With it, she could run twice the head of cattle through the dry months. The math was simple. The obstacle was a single man who kept writing no in pencil on her letters. Now there was a woman living in that cabin, which Dorothea Aldridge had clearly decided changed the equation in her favor. Nora opened the door. Dorothea looked her over with the slow, measuring appraisal of someone conducting an evaluation, rather than a greeting. From the practical bun of her hair to the plain wool dress to the worn boots, each element noted, catalogued, assigned its value. The assessment took perhaps 4 seconds. Then, in the sweetest possible voice, "You must be the new arrangement." Nora held the door open wider. "Mrs. Aldridge?" Her voice was warm the way January sunlight is warm present, but not particularly warming. "Come inside." Callan came around the corner of the cabin from the woodpile just as Dorothea stepped onto the porch, and his expression at the sight of her underwent no visible change, which was itself a kind of change. "Mrs. Aldridge." "Mr. Morrow." Her smile was the smile of a person who has already decided the outcome of the conversation and is simply observing the preliminary steps with polite interest. "I heard you'd taken a wife under rather peculiar circumstances." The circumstances were straightforward enough. She glanced at Nora with the particular condescension of a woman who has decided another woman is beneath notice but wants her to know it. "I'm certain they were. A young woman alone with debts and a lonely man with acreage. Very practical." Her eyes came back to Callan. I wonder if you've considered the complications of your position here. I'm not aware of complications. Dorothea tilted her head slightly the way a person tilts their head when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. The Powder River Landowners Association has been reviewing several old water claims in this portion of the territory. There's a provision from 1871 that may affect the creek access on your northern boundary. I'd hate for you to invest another season here, only to find the legal ground less solid than you believed. It was a lie. Callan recognized its architecture immediately. The vague reference to unnamed documents, the friendly tone concealing the threat, the word hate deployed with maximum insincerity. What it was not was an empty lie. The truth of a legal threat was irrelevant to its cost. Fighting it required lawyers' time filings money. The Aldridge operation had a retained attorney in Cheyenne. Callan had a pencil. Nora stepped forward from the doorway. Her voice, when she used it, was the quietest in the room and carried the farthest. "Thank you for the visit, Mrs. Aldridge. The road back to town is better before the light goes." Dorothea looked at her with new attention. The assessment upgrading itself in real time, recalibrating to account for something it had initially underweighted. A slow smile. Then she stepped off the porch, moving toward the buggy without hurry, conveying through the unhurriedness that she was departing on her own schedule. She paused at the buggy step, addressing Callan as though Nora were not present. "That woman has a spine, a beat. Pity it won't be enough." The buggy moved back up the canyon road. They watched it go. Callan stood beside Nora on the porch, and neither of them spoke until the sound of the wheels had faded past the first bend. And then Nora said, without heat, without theater, "She'll come back with something more specific than a rumor about an 1871 provision." "Yes. We should know the land records better than she does." "We should." Nora went inside to put more water on the stove. Callan watched the empty road for a moment longer, the way a man watches weather move away, not because it's gone, but because knowing its direction tells you where it's going to come from next time. The information about the water claim came from Silas Greer, who heard it from the man who ran the Garnet Creek Land Office, who had been approached by a Cheyenne attorney with questions about the creek survey from 1871. The attorney's name was Pendleton. He was retained by the Aldridge estate. The questions he was asking were the kind that preceded a formal legal challenge, not the kind that preceded genuine uncertainty. Dorothea was not investigating whether she had a legitimate claim. She was building the appearance of one. Callan brought this information home on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of December. Nora listened with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking at the wall above his shoulder, the way she looked at things she was thinking hard about rather than seeing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then, "She knows you can't afford to fight it in Cheyenne. That's the point of it. So the threat doesn't need to be real. It only needs to be expensive." Her eyes came back to him. "What happens if we establish clearly that the claim has no basis before Pendleton can formalize it?" She'd need to find a different approach. Nora was quiet again. Then she reached for the accounts ledger and turned to the back pages where she had been keeping notes on the property survey. She had read the survey documents 2 weeks after arriving, not because she'd been asked to, but because she was the kind of person who read the documents relating to any property she was responsible for managing. Callan watched her trace a line with her fingertip following the notation for the creek boundary. Her expression was the one she wore when she was solving something focused without being tense, the concentration of a person who trusts her own process. "I'll go to the land office Monday," she said. "I want copies of every recorded deed and water right associated with this property going back to the original survey. That's a half day of work. Then I'll start early." What happened in the dead middle of January arrived without the courtesy of warning, though the warning had been present in retrospect in the particular quality of the night, the wind that had died too early, the cold that had come down from the north too hard, the smell that Callan registered at somewhere between sleep and waking as wrong before his conscious mind identified it as kerosene. He was outside in under a minute. The hay barn's east wall was burning with the low, fast commitment of fire, given the right conditions, not the tentative flickering of an accident, but the concentrated purpose of something that had been started by a person who knew what they were doing. The flames had the east wall and were moving toward the roof with the leisure of something confident in its outcome. Callan shouted once toward the cabin and ran for the water pump. He did not need to shout a second time. Nora came through the cabin door in 20 seconds, pulling her coat over her nightclothes, carrying the bucket from the washstand. She looked at the burning wall for approximately half a second, the assessment she needed, then moved to the pump to take the bucket he was already filling. They worked for just over an hour in the freezing dark. Callan at the pump, Nora running the relay, both of them coughing in the smoke that the windless cold kept low to the ground. The work had no heroics in it. It was simply continuous physical effort applied to the problem in front of them, which was the only way any hard problem had ever been solved in Callan's experience. The east wall was gone by the time they had the fire outboards charred to the studs, the hay inside reduced to black ash still glowing at its base. The structural frame of the barn was intact. Trace and the gray mare were in the south pasture, which was the only genuinely fortunate fact of the evening. When it was done, they stood in the snow outside the barn and looked at what was left. Nora's hair had come down from wherever she'd pinned it and hung across her face in the smoke-thickened air. Her hands, when he saw them in the light from the dying embers, were red from the cold water. She was not shaking from cold. She was shaking from the particular depletion that follows sustained desperate effort, the body's invoice for what the will has borrowed. Callan found her coat on the ground where she had dropped it coming out of the cabin and put it around her shoulders. She did not thank him. She was looking at the ruined wall with an expression that had traveled a long distance from upset and arrived somewhere cooler. She did this. Not a question. Not an accusation that needed an answer. A conclusion reached by a mind that had been working the problem since she first smelled the smoke. Callan crouched near the base of the exterior wall where the snow had the sharp mineral bite of kerosene, even over the dominant smell of char. The fire had started here, not at the lamp line, not at the stove connection at the base of the outside wall, where a person who wanted a fire to look accidental would not start it, and a person who simply wanted a fire would. 3 feet to the left, half buried in the snow, he found a metal flask, the hinged kind that travelers carried with the initials FR pressed into the side. He held it up where Nora could see it. Fenton Rudd, her voice hard and precise as a land survey. He runs Aldridge's difficult errands. She looked at the flask, then at the ruined wall, then at Callan with the expression of a person converting emotion directly into forward motion. We ride to Casper at first light. There was a drawer in Nora's side of the cabin, the shallow one in the small table Edmund's letter had occupied. Callan had never opened it. He did not open it now deliberately. He was looking for the extra lamp wick he kept in the main table's lower drawer and pulled the wrong one by half a foot before he realized his error, and in the half-open gap he saw paper, a folded sheet, unaddressed, the handwriting, Nora's, which he recognized from 6 weeks of account ledgers and supply lists. The letter was unfinished. He could see only the first 3 lines before the angle of the drawer obscured the rest, but 3 lines were enough. The salutation was Mrs. Fairwick at the Larkspur boarding house. The first line said that Nora expected to return before the end of the month. The second line said she would settle the remaining balance on arrival. He closed the drawer carefully. He did not move for a moment. The letter was unfinished. It had been started and set down. The date he could not see, but the context was not difficult to reconstruct. The evening after she had read Edmund's letter, after their exchange at the table, after she had gone behind the curtain to be alone with whatever she needed to be alone with. She had sat down that night to write her way out of this arrangement. She had not finished the letter. She had not sent it. He did not know why she had stopped. He did not know if she had decided or simply deferred again. What he knew was that the letter existed, which meant the question it represented had not been answered, only suspended. She was still in some portion of herself running the calculation. He found the lamp wick in the correct drawer lit. It carried it to the table. The stove needed another log. He put one in. He did these small things with careful attention because there was nothing else available to do at this hour with this particular piece of knowledge, and because the alternative was to stand in the middle of the room and feel the weight of it without performing any useful function. The following morning, he went out before dawn and fixed the broken step on the porch, the second one from the top, which had a soft spot in the centerboard. She had stepped around every day for 6 weeks. He replaced the board before she was up, so that when she came out at first light, she stepped on it without thinking, and it held without complaint, and neither of them mentioned that it had ever been otherwise. He moved the second oil lamp to the corner of the cabin near the window, where the light in the evenings was better for reading. He said nothing about this either. He was not performing these acts in the hope that she would notice them, or not only that. He was performing them because it was the only language he had for the thing he could not say, which was stay. Not because you have to, not because your father arranged it, because this becomes something different than either of us expected, and I would like to know what that is. They rode to Casper at first light 2 days after the fire. The winter dawn came up red over the eastern breaks, and the cold on horseback was the kind that required attention to all the right layers. And Nora rode with the easy competence of someone who had spent considerable time on horseback in difficult country, which was another detail for the account he was building of her. She carried the kerosene flask in her coat pocket wrapped in cloth so the smell wouldn't reach the horses. Sheriff Braddock ran the Casper office with the unhurried precision of a man who had heard enough stories to distinguish the ones that mattered from the ones that didn't. He listened to the whole account without interrupting the flask, with its initials, the point of origin, the timing relative to Dorothea's visit, the water claim, and the Cheyenne attorney. He asked 2 questions. Then he pulled on his coat without further comment. Fenton Rudd was located at the Continental Saloon on 2nd Street at 9:15 in the morning, nursing something that was not his first drink of the day. This fact alone told its own story. He was a large man with the slightly glazed look of someone who had been carrying a secret that was heavier than he'd estimated when he agreed to carry it. Braddock was methodical. Fenton Rudd, it turned out, had not been paid the second half of what Dorothea had promised him, which made his loyalty substantially more negotiable than it might otherwise have been. By noon, he had signed a statement. The statement named Dorothea Aldridge, named a figure $40, named the instruction to make the fire look accidental, named his own failure at that instruction. While Braddock was working through the statement, Nora was at the Casper land office. She had asked Braddock the name of the recording clerk before she left his office, which Callan noticed the way he noticed everything she did that revealed the shape of how she operated. She spent an hour and 15 minutes in the land office, returning to where Callan waited outside with the horses, carrying a folded sheaf of documents tucked under her arm, with the controlled satisfaction of someone who has gone to find ammunition and returned with more than they needed. That evening, the documents covered the table. Nora moved through them with the focused quiet she brought to the account's pencil in hand, occasionally making a note on a separate sheet, occasionally holding a page closer to the lamp. Callan sat across from her, watching the work rather than the documents, and there was something in the specific quality of her attention, the way she held a particular page with both hands when she found what she was looking for, that he recognized as the same quality in a good horse when it finally understands what's being asked of it. Not submission, recognition. She looked up. The lamp between them caught the lines of her face in a way that made her look older than 24 and younger at the same time. Or maybe it was simply that she looked more like herself than she had 6 weeks ago, more settled into the particular shape of who she was. 3 boundary discrepancies. Her voice carrying the careful restraint of someone controlling their own reaction to what they'd found. All on the northern edge, all in Aldridge's claim survey. She's been claiming 11 feet of easement that doesn't exist in the original 1868 deed. The water claim she told Pendleton to build a case around, it's based entirely on that false easement. Callan looked at the documents, then at her. She doesn't just want the land. Nora set the paper down with a deliberateness that was something more than deliberateness. Her voice when she spoke had the quality of a sentence that has been stripped of everything except what it needs. She wants to erase us from it. All of it. The water, the acreage, the legal record. She wants this property to have no defensible history that isn't hers. Callan held her gaze. The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the Powder River night pressed its full cold weight against the cabin walls, and the fire in the stove clicked as it settled. There was something in the way she had said us, unplanned, unremarked, delivered with the same matter-of-fact precision as everything else that he filed without comment in the same place he kept the coffee chiffé for 2 every morning. He was still waiting, but the calculation was changing, and he could feel it changing the way you feel weather coming before the sky gives it away. The Powder River Landowners Association withdrew its support of Dorothea's water challenge on the 3rd day of February, which was a Thursday, and the news moved through Garnet Creek with the particular velocity of information that confirms what most people had already suspected. Braddock had been methodical. Fenton Rudd's signed statement was specific, dated, witnessed. The Cheyenne attorney Pendleton quietly withdrew from the engagement 2 days after that, sending a brief letter to the land office that contained no explanation beyond the standard language of professional disengagement, which was itself a kind of explanation. The false easement Nora had found in the boundary records was filed with the Territorial Surveyor's Office under a formal discrepancy notice in her handwriting, precise as a blade. It should have been over. Dorothea Aldridge, in Callan's estimation, was not a person who accepted the word over from anyone but herself. The Wyoming Territorial Gazette printed twice a week. The edition that appeared on the 8th of February carried a front-page item below the fold, 6 column inches, written with the careful indirection of a man who knows how close to the legal line he is standing. The item did not name Callan in its headline. It named him in its third sentence in the context of a question about the fitness of parties currently in a land dispute with the Aldridge estate. The item referenced an incident from 1876, Callan's first year in the territory, when he had been serving as a temporary member of the Carbon County Civil Patrol, a volunteer arrangement common in that period, before formal law enforcement reached the more remote portions of Wyoming. The item said that a man named Wesley Prout had been held on Callan's testimony for 14 months before the case against him was dismissed for insufficient evidence. It said that Prout had maintained his innocence throughout. It said nothing false, which made it more damaging than a lie would have been. Callan read the paper at the general store on his supply run, standing at the counter with the newsprint in both hands and the store owner finding reasons to occupy himself at the far end of the room. He read the item twice. He folded the paper and paid for his supplies and drove home. The 6 miles gave him enough time to reach the decision he had already known somewhere below, conscious deliberation that he was going to reach. Nora was in the garden when he returned, turning the frozen topsoil with the iron fork she used to prepare the beds before the hard freeze made it impossible the work she did every February, on the argument that the soil remembered preparation even through winter. She saw his face when he came through the gate, not its expression, because his expression had not changed, but something in the quality of its stillness that was different from ordinary stillness. The way still water over a strong current is different from still water over a flat bottom. She set down the fork. He handed her the folded paper open to the item. She read it standing up, and he watched her read it the way he watched weather, not the sky itself, but what the sky was doing, the incremental shifts that told you what was building. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment with the paper held at her side. She wrote this. She gave Fenton to Braddock because she knew she was losing the land claim. She was already building this before the statement was signed. Nora looked at him. Wesley Prout. Yes. Tell me. He had not told this to anyone who didn't already know the shape of it. He had not told it because the shape of it did not improve with repetition, and because the people who needed to know had known without being told. Braddock had known, Silas Greer had known, Edmund had known. But Nora was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was asking for the thing underneath the thing, not the account of events, but the weight of them. And he found that the story came out differently when told to someone who already knew his face well enough to read it. In the spring of 1876, he had been 4 months in the territory, new enough to be uncertain, old enough to know that uncertainty was a liability he needed to correct quickly. The Civil Patrol was 3 men, 2 of them experienced, one of them, Callan. A series of thefts from supply wagons on the Carbon County Road, smallish stuff but consistent. The pattern of someone who needed money more than they needed things. The experienced men had a suspect. Wesley Prout, 23 years old, had been seen near 2 of the hit locations, had a prior record from Missouri involving a minor theft at 17, had no fixed employment. The case against him was circumstantial, but to Callan's inexperienced eye coherent. Callan's testimony at the preliminary hearing was 3 sentences long. He had seen Prout near the Carmody wagon site on the Tuesday of the second theft. He could not say Prout had taken anything. He could say Prout had been there when he had no stated business being there. It was enough, combined with the other testimony, to hold Prout pending a full hearing that the circuit court, overwhelmed and understaffed, kept postponing. 14 months later, the circuit court finally convened. A witness came forward who placed Prout 40 miles away. On the day of the first theft, the case collapsed. Prout was released. The actual thief was identified 2 years later as one of the experienced patrol members who had been supplementing his income for several years before the pattern caught up with him. Callan had resigned from the patrol the day after Prout's release without waiting for anyone to ask him to. He had spent 3 months rebuilding the understanding of his own judgment that the episode had dismantled, and he had arrived at a position not of restored confidence, but of calibrated skepticism, a permanent awareness of the distance between what appeared to be true and what was true, applied with particular rigor to his own perceptions. It had made him a better man in most respects. It had also made him a harder one. He had found Wesley Prout the following spring, working a farm outside Rawlins. He had gone there on horseback alone, unannounced. He had stood on the man's porch and told him in plain language that his testimony had been the final weight in an insufficient scale. Prout had looked at him for a long time. Then he had gone back inside his house and closed the door without a word, which was an answer of a kind. Callan had ridden home. He had not sought absolution elsewhere because he did not believe he had earned it. Nora held the folded paper and listened to all of this. When he finished, she was quiet for the span of several breaths, the kind of quiet that means processing rather than judgment. Then Father knew this story. He knew most of what there was to know about me. He sent me here anyway. She let that settle, both of them understanding what it meant. He was never wrong about a person, Callan, not once in my memory. He looked at the garden behind her, at the turned soil with its dark winter smell, at the work she had been doing before he came through the gate. He thought about Edmund Hale knowing this story and writing that letter anyway, writing it with the compressed, deliberate handwriting of a man who chose each word carefully because he was running out of occasions to choose words. He thought about what it meant to be known accurately by someone who chose you anyway. He had not experienced that in a long time. Possibly he had not experienced it exactly ever. The following morning he rode to Garnet Creek, not to Braddock's office, not to the land office, to the Gazette. The editor's name was Hollis Crane, a thin man in his 40s with ink-stained fingers and the slightly harried quality of someone running a two-person operation that required six. He was setting type when Callan arrived and looked up without particular alarm. Callan's arrival was unusual, but his demeanor as always communicated that whatever he had come to do was going to proceed at his own pace, regardless of anyone else's preference. There were 4 other people in the front room when Callan stated his purpose. Crane, his printing assistant, a woman waiting to place a classified notice, Silas Greer, who happened to be there picking up a back issue. Callan did not ask them to leave. He stood in the center of the room with the February 8th edition in one hand and said he wanted to respond to the item on page 1 in person to anyone who was present to hear it. Crane set down his type. The woman with the classified notice did not leave. Callan told it exactly as he had told it to Nora the previous afternoon. The patrol, the testimony, the 14 months, the actual thief, the visit to Rawlins, the closed door. He did not defend his original testimony as reasonable, given his experience at the time, though it had been. He did not contextualize the outcome with the information about the actual thief, though it mitigated the picture. He presented the sequence without framing because the sequence was what it was, and anyone in that room was capable of drawing their own conclusions without his assistance in drawing them toward the favorable ones. When he finished, the room was quiet in the particular way of rooms where people are recalibrating. Then, "I'm not here to be forgiven." His voice in the small space carried no effort in it, no performance of conviction. "I'm here because the truth about what I did doesn't need Mrs. Aldridge to tell it." Silas Greer in the back of the room set down the back issue he'd been holding. "I knew that story before I signed your wedding paper." His voice had the unhurried quality of a man confirming something that was never in doubt for him. "Figured it was your story to tell, not mine." Crane printed a follow-up item in the next edition, February 12th, running in the same position below the fold, approximately the same length. He wrote it in plain declarative sentences without editorial comment, which was the most honest form of editorial comment available to him. The Aldridge estate did not respond in print. The Aldridge estate, as it turned out, had larger problems by then than managing the public narrative of a land dispute it had already lost. The news that Dorothea had attempted to intimidate a neighboring landowner through deliberate arson moved through the territory's property-owning community with the speed of information that affects people's livelihoods. The Carbon County deed records showing the false easement notation now formally on file were reviewed by 2 other landowners who had boundary issues with the Aldridge estate, both of whom found their own discrepancies. By the 3rd week of February, Dorothea had 2 additional formal complaints filed against her with the Territorial Land Commissioner, neither of which Callan had any hand in. He came home on the evening of the 12th to find Nora at the table with a cup of tea, gone cold, reading the Gazette's follow-up item. She looked up when he came in, held his gaze for a moment with an expression that contained several things. Simultaneously relief, something that was not quite pride, but occupied the same territory, the residue of a long breath finally completed. She did not say anything about the item specifically. What she said was, "Supper's been keeping warm for an hour." It was in its way the most complete sentence she had said to him. The envelope had been in the cedar box since November. Nora had placed it there after reading the first letter, Edmund's letter addressed to Callan, and had not opened the box again for 3 months, because the box held the things she was not ready to look at. Directly her mother's ring. A photograph of Edmund from his trapping years, the two letters in their single envelope. She had believed there was one letter because she had felt one letter through the sealed paper, which was what she had believed and what she had been wrong about. She found the second letter on a Sunday morning in late February while Callan was working the fence line on the property's north boundary, a repair job that had been waiting since the fall. The cedar box was open on the table when he came back in at midday, the first letter flat beside it, the second letter in Nora's hands. She was sitting very still at the table with the quality of stillness that means a person has just received information that is reorganizing their interior landscape. She heard him at the door. She did not put the letter down. He came to the table, saw the cedar box, the two letters separated out for the first time, Nora's face in the noon light coming through the east window. He did not ask. He waited, which was his nature, and in this case his nature was exactly right. Nora looked at the letter in her hands. Edmund's handwriting smaller than usual, as though he had been aware he was spending something finite. The outside of the second envelope had 4 words written on it. Read after you stay. She had not read it in November because she had not known it existed. She had not known it existed until 3 minutes ago, when she had opened the cedar box to look for a sewing needle. She thought she might have stored there, and her fingers had found the thickness of 2 sheets where she had believed there was one. She read it aloud, not because she had decided to share it, but because the words seemed to require a voice larger than the interior one, seemed to need the air of the room around them, rather than only the air of her own head. Edmund's voice as she read it was so precisely itself that Callan felt the loss of the man as a physical thing, specific, the way a cold spot in a room is specific, occupying a definable space. Nora, by the time you read this, you will have decided to stay, which means you have done something I wasn't sure you were capable of, which is let someone see you needing something without calling it something else. I know you. You will have told yourself you stayed because the arrangement was practical, because the debt to your resources made leaving unreasonable, because you had committed to 6 months and you don't break commitments. All of this will be partially true, and none of it will be the real reason. The real reason is that you wanted to stay. You wanted the thing that was being built there, whatever it is by the time you read this. You wanted it enough to stop writing the letter to Mrs. Fairwick. Don't let your head explain away what your heart already knows. That man deserves to hear you say it plainly. So does the part of you that chose it, your father. The room held the words after her voice stopped. The stove gave a single tick. The noon light was flat through the window and very still. Nora folded the letter along its creases. She put it flat on the table beside the first one. She looked at them both, lying there, Edmund's 2 letters written across the same months of his dying, with the same compressed care, one sent north to a man who needed preparing, one kept for a daughter who needed time. The precision of it, the love and the precision of it was almost unbearable. In the way that genuine goodness sometimes is, it does not protect you from its full weight. She stood up from the table without looking at Callan. She put on her coat, the heavy one she wore for outdoor work. She went out through the door. He watched through the window as she crossed the yard toward the north fence line, where he had been working her boots, finding their way through the late February snow that had gone soft at the top from 3 consecutive days of afternoon sun. He stood at the window for a moment, then followed. The north fence line was a quarter-mile from the cabin. By the time he reached her, she was standing at the post he had been setting when he came in for midday, her back to him, looking north across the plateau, where the winter grass was beginning to show the first colorless suggestion of what it would become in another 6 weeks. The air at this hour had a quality particular to late winter Wyoming, neither cold nor warm, suspended between its 2 seasons, like a breath held between inhale and exhale. He stopped a few feet behind her. She did not turn around. Neither of them said anything for a moment that was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of shared quiet they had been building for 4 months, the kind that no longer required filling. Then Nora turned to face him. Her expression was not the assembled, managed expression she had been wearing since November. It was not the expression she wore when she was thinking hard about a problem or managing a difficult feeling from a safe distance. It was simply her face, with everything in it. I tore up the letter to Mrs. Fairwick. Her voice was level, unhurried, completely, without the protective quality it sometimes carried. Not this morning, weeks ago, the night after the fire, when I understood what the fire meant. A breath. I need you to know it wasn't because I had nowhere else. I've had nowhere else before. I know what that feels like, and it doesn't feel like this. Callan looked at her. The plateau stretched wide behind her, the red rock of the canyon rim in the distance catching the afternoon light, everything open in the way Wyoming was open without apology for its own scale. What does this feel like? She held his gaze without flinching. Like somewhere I chose. A pause. Like someone I chose. That's what I need to say plainly because Father was right that you deserve to hear it. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man composing a response, but the silence of a man receiving something he had been careful not to want too directly. Then I know. The words came out with the same weight as everything else he said that mattered, unornamented, exact, carrying more in their brevity than a longer sentence could have held. I've known for a while. I was waiting for you to be certain enough to say it. Nora looked at him with an expression that had in it something he had not seen from her before, something that had not been available to her in November when she was carrying too much at once. The grief was still there. It would be there for a long time, because Edmund Hale had been the fixed point of her world for 24 years. But it coexisted now with something that was not grief's opposite, but was perhaps its counterweight, the particular quality of presence that comes when a person stops merely surviving their circumstances and begins consciously to inhabit them. She smiled, not the brief surprise thing that had escaped her at the supper table in November. The full version, the one that started at her eyes and worked outward, staying when it arrived, reshaping her whole face into something that Callan understood. Looking at it, he was going to see in his memory for the rest of his life. Then you will, she said, every day. Dorothea Aldridge's ranch sold in the second week of March to a cattle consortium from Denver. The transaction completed through a Cheyenne attorney, a different one from Pendleton, with no public announcement. She was not seen in Garnet Creek after the sale closed. She left Wyoming territory without ceremony and without acknowledged destination, and no one in the territory organized any form of farewell, which communicated more about her standing in the community than anything that had been said publicly about her during the preceding months. The Powder River Landowners Association formally recorded Callan's creek water rights on March 22, 1884, with 3 board members present, a quorum the minimum required for a formal resolution. The recording clerk who filed the paperwork was the same one Nora had spoken to in the Casper Land Office in January. He noted in the margin of the filing that the original 1868 deed had been verified against 3 independent survey records. The notation was unnecessary but accurate, and in a territory where the legal record was still being assembled from scratch, accuracy was its own form of argument. Spring came late that year, as spring came late, most years in Wyoming arriving not gradually, but in the sudden decided way of that country. One week the plateau was still carrying winter's color palette of gray and brown. The next week green was pushing through everywhere at once, the river running fast with snowmelt, the red rock warming in the afternoon sun from the east. The garden beds Nora had prepared in February coming to life with the uncomplicated confidence of seeds that had been waiting for exactly this. She had planned those beds through the January evenings with catalogs spread across the table, while Callan worked on the harness repair and the stove gave it steady warmth, and neither of them was aware of how domestic the scene was because neither of them was watching it from outside. The barn's east wall came back up in April. Callan spent 3 weeks hauling timber from the canyon ridge, selecting pieces with the patient care of a man who has learned that the second construction of a thing should exceed the first. When the framing was complete, Nora appeared one morning with a bucket of red ochre wash she had mixed herself from pigment bought in Garnet Creek, saying only that the new wall should match the old one. He did not argue. He had learned over 5 months that she was usually right about what a thing needed, that her eye for the practical and her eye for the fitting were not in competition, but were in fact the same eye. The wall, when she finished, looked better than it had before the fire. It looked like it had always been that color, which was perhaps the best thing a repaired thing could achieve. Not the erasure of damage, but the assimilation of it into the whole, so that the whole became something it hadn't been before. The barn dances were her idea. The first one was in May, a Saturday, announced by a hand-lettered notice she posted at Garner's Mercantile and the Garnet Creek Post Office on a Wednesday, inviting anyone in the county to bring an instrument if they had one. Callan's reaction to this plan had been a silence that she had correctly read as concern rather than opposition, and she had looked at him across the supper table with the particular patience of a woman who has learned how a specific man's silences are organized. People don't come to places they feel welcome. They become welcome by coming. He had thought about this for 2 days before concluding that she was right, which was a faster conclusion than he usually reached on social matters. 14 people came to the first dance, 22 to the second. By July, the first Saturday of each month had become a fixture on the informal calendar of the surrounding county. The kind of event that people built other plans around that children look forward to, with the whole body anticipation of childhood that older people attended because it reminded them what the territory could be when it chose to be hospitable rather than merely survivable. The hay barn with its new east wall, its red ochre finish, its floor cleared of equipment for one evening each month was the right size for these gatherings, large enough to hold a crowd, small enough to feel full. Nora ran the dances with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything, which meant that they felt effortless from the outside, while requiring considerable management from the inside, which is the true definition of a well-run thing. Callan helped by moving heavy objects when directed by keeping the water and coffee supply consistent by being present in his particular way, standing at the edge of things, watching, saying little but available, in the way that a weight-bearing structure is available, not noticed until it's needed, completely necessary when it is. People in Garnet Creek had been adjusting their understanding of Callan Morrow since February. The Gazette item had done something unexpected, not by revealing the story, but by the manner of its revelation. A man who walks into a room where 4 people are present and tells an unflattering truth about himself without being asked is a different category of man than the one most people had constructed from the available evidence. The category they had constructed, dangerous, solitary, best approached with caution, was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in the way that all constructions based on a person's most dramatic moments are incomplete. What the February morning revealed was the longer, slower, less dramatic truth that Callan Morrow was a man who held himself accountable to standards that did not shift with the pressure of circumstance. Silas Greer had said at the May dance to the man standing next to him while watching Callan carry a bench across the barn floor at Nora's direction, "I've known 2 or 3 men in my life who were genuinely good. Not decent good. He's one. It just took the right person to make it visible." The man next to him had not fully understood this observation, but he had remembered it the way people sometimes remember things they don't yet have the context to understand. The garden that summer was extraordinary by any measure. Nora had planted it with the logic of a person who had grown up following a resourceful man through 3 territories and had absorbed through proximity the principle that planning was the gap between what you had and what you needed. She had put in more than they could use deliberately with the specific intention of having more than they needed. Through a dry August that punished every other kitchen garden in the county, the Morrow property's creek access kept the soil workable, the water consistent, the rows of beans and squash and root vegetables producing past the point where the rest of the county had given up. She started bringing the surplus to Garnet Creek on Thursdays, loading the wagon bed with whatever was past its storage window, leaving it at the general store, with the instruction that it was available to whoever needed it. By the 3rd Thursday, people knew to check. By midsummer, the arrangement had become quietly essential to 3 or 4 households that would not have said they needed it, which is often the most important kind of need. The summer of 1884 in the valley east of Powder River was in the account that most people in Garnet Creek would give of that period in later years. The summer when the canyon property stopped being the place where that Morrow man lived and became something harder to name. Briefly, a place that was part of the county in the way that certain places become part of the county. Not through official designation, but through the slow accumulation of occasions that matter. On an evening in late July, Callan sat on the porch steps, watching the last of the day's light move down the canyon wall while Nora read inside by the lamp he had moved to the right corner of the cabin. The sound of her turning a page reached him through the open door. The river was audible below the canyon rim, running lower now than it had in spring, but still present, still moving. The horses were settled in the stable. The garden was dark rose against the lighter ground, the smell of it reaching him on the evening air. Soil growth, the specific green smell of something tended that had come into its full season. Edmund Hale had died in October of the previous year, knowing that the territory he was leaving was not at its best, the place most people made it. He had spent his life moving through it and doing the kind of work it needed, the unspectacular work of reliable presence, carrying an injured man across dark country, writing careful letters to people who needed them before he was gone, arranging what he could arrange while he still had hands to arrange it. He had done all of this without expecting acknowledgement, because acknowledgement was not the point. The point was the outcome, the thing that persisted after the person who made it possible had stopped being present to see it. He had sent his daughter to a man she had never met, trusting what he knew of both of them to do the work that he could not do for them. He had been correct with the precision of a person who has paid very careful attention to people for a long time, who knows that genuine character is not the sum of a person's best performances, but the pattern of how they behave when no one who matters is watching. He had watched Callan Morrow for 7 years. He had watched Nora Hale for 24. He had done the arithmetic in the spring of 1883, sitting with his diagnosis in a Carson City doctor's office, before the letters were written, before any of it was set in motion. What he had known, which both of them had had to discover in their own time, was this: two people who have each learned to carry their weight alone do not become weaker when they stop carrying it alone. They become capable of carrying something larger. The thing they build together is not the sum of what they each could build separately. It is a different category of thing entirely. The lamp in the cabin window threw its steady light across the porch boards. Nora's voice came through the doorway, reading aloud without preamble from the book she had opened, the way she sometimes did when she found a passage that required air around it. A man who expects nothing from the world is not a pessimist. He is a man who has decided to be surprised by its goodness rather than disappointed by its failure. Callan listened to this. He looked at the canyon wall in the last of the July light, at the red rock going dark from the top down as the sun finished its descent. He thought about a morning in November when he had driven 6 miles in cold air with a woman he had met 3 days prior to stand in a land office for 9 minutes. He thought about all the distance between that morning and this evening, the months of careful work, the fire in the dark, the documents spread across the table, the letter in a cedar box, a woman standing at a fence post in late February. Snow saying, like someone I chose, with the plainness of someone who has finally stopped managing the truth at a distance. He turned and looked through the doorway at Nora sitting in the lamplight with the book held in both hands, her feet tucked under her on the chair, entirely at home, in the way a person is entirely at home when they have stopped treating a place as temporary. She felt his gaze and looked up, and what passed between them in that glance was not any single communicable thing, but the accumulated weight of all the things they had not needed to say, because they had both been paying enough attention to already know them. "Come inside," she said. "The cold is coming off the canyon." He got up from the porch steps. He went inside. The door closed. The lamp burned steady in the window, visible from the road. The kind of light that means someone is home and intends to remain there, the kind that travelers in dark country navigate toward, without knowing why, only knowing that the sight of it does something to the cold. Edmund Hale had not sent his daughter into the territory to be rescued. He had sent two people toward each other because he understood, with the clear-eyed certainty of a man who has spent a long life watching what people do when the weight gets heavy, that neither of them would have found what they needed by searching for it directly. Goodness of that order, the quiet structural kind, the kind that holds things up rather than announcing itself, does not advertise. It waits. It builds in the dark. It becomes visible only in the fullness of time, when the thing it was building finally stands complete in the light of an ordinary summer evening, so unremarkable from the outside and so entirely remarkable within. He had known. He had always known. That was the thing about a man who paid genuine attention to the people in front of him. He saw not what they were at their most difficult moment, but what they were capable of becoming when the right conditions finally arrived. He had seen it in both of them separately across years. He had done the only thing left available to him, which was to arrange the conditions. The rest had been theirs.